Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Accessing Funding Sources for Affordable Housing and Equity-Eligible Commercial Building Retrofits. My name is Angelina Benson-Glanz, and I'm with Elevate. Before we start today, I'll turn it over to our interpreters to explain how you can access simultaneous Spanish interpretation during today's webinar.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Hi, I'm Ana Vidales, and you'll be your interpreter for today. And to access interpretation, I'll explain it in Spanish. Si ustedes quieren oír esta reunión en español, lo que tienen que hacer es irse al botón de interpretación, ¿verdad? Eligen su idioma de preferencia, que sería el español. También está la opción de silenciar el audio original. Si ustedes eligen eso, entonces solamente van a escuchar a la intérprete. De lo contrario, escucharían al intérprete a un 80% y al ponente a un 20%. Si ustedes están en un teléfono o en un iPad, tienen que apretar los 3 puntitos que dicen More, Language Interpretation, y eligen su idioma. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. We appreciate you. Next, we'd like to walk through some housekeeping announcements. We are recording today's webinar, and we will be making it available for registrants within a few business days. It will also be posted on the R2E2 events page. To ask a question today, please utilize the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. We'll reserve time at the end to answer the questions. You can upvote questions in the Q&A box that you'd like us to prioritize, and please use the chat to engage in a respectful and productive discussion with other participants. Please keep in mind R2E2 does have a code of conduct and will not tolerate behaviors that cause harm or disrupt the learning environment. Please direct message Gustavo Cordero if you feel unsafe in this space. Disruptive participants may be removed from the webinar. By participating in this webinar, you are agreeing to uphold a culture of respect and contribute to a productive learning environment. Again, thank you for understanding, and please let Gustavo know if you have any questions or concerns. And now I'd like to introduce Holly Carr from the U.S. Department of Energy's Buildings Technology Office to provide an overview of the Buildings Upgrade Prize before we dive into today's topic, accessing funding sources.
Thank you, Angelina. Hello, everyone. And as Angelina said, I am coming to you from the U.S. Department of Energy and the Building Technologies Office. We have a strong partnership with R2E2 through the Buildings Upgrade Prize, and just want to give you a little overview of the prize as it's quite relevant to a lot of the things that you're going to be learning about today. Next slide, please. So the Buildings Upgrade Prize was recently announced in January. Applications are now open, and this prize is really designed to rapidly scale energy efficiency and efficient electrification of buildings in communities across the country. The prize is envisioned to consist of 4 phases over approximately 5 years. Today, I'll be talking to you specifically about the phase 1 or concept phase that is now open, which will include $22 million, more than $22 million in prizes, cash prizes, and technical assistance to winning teams. So the applications are open now and will close on July 18th. And we're looking for 20 to 60 teams to join what we're calling a co-opetition, in the sense that we really hope that all of the teams that we select in phase 1 can be successful throughout progressive phases, and that they can work together and share information to help all of the teams go further faster. You can see the URL there on the bottom of the slide, as well as a QR code that you can just capture with your phone to go to the website for the Buildings Upgrade Prize and see more details. I do want to note that we have an application support prize that is open right now for new and under-resourced teams. So if you've never applied to a building technologies office or never successfully applied to building technologies office funding in the past, you're a new team or under-resourced, this application support prize could be a real important piece for you. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, the goals of this prize are to really address non-technical barriers to improving energy efficiency and removing on-site emissions in buildings. We have the technologies to do these building upgrades, right? We have heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. We know how to insulate buildings, but it's really those non-technical barriers, administrative barriers, financial barriers, social communications, to letting people know that these upgrades are available. Those are the things that are in large part keeping us from seeing widespread building upgrades across the country. We're still only seeing about 1 to 2% of our nation's 125 million buildings being upgraded every year. So we're really hoping to be able to accelerate building upgrades across communities in the United States, and specifically in this prize, to benefit underserved communities. Next slide, please. So along those lines, we have two pathways in this prize. One is the equity-centered innovation pathway. So teams that choose this pathway and win in phase one will win $400,000 in cash, plus technical assistance to support their initiative development. And they'll be asked to design replicable and scalable building upgrade initiatives to address many buildings in their community, but in equity eligible buildings. And I'll define that in a little more detail in just a moment. The second pathway is the open innovation pathway. Winners in that pathway will receive $200,000 in cash and access to technical assistance. They're also asked to develop these replicable building upgrade initiatives, which may focus on equity, but they are not required to. Next slide, please. So equity eligible buildings for the purposes of this prize are defined as buildings in a specific geographic location, including any building that's in a Justice 40 census tract, on tribal land, or in a US territory, as well as any type of affordable housing, both subsidized and naturally occurring, and underserved commercial buildings such as Title I schools and buildings that are housing community services or nonprofits, or in a disadvantaged business area. And there's also a team defined category. So if we missed something, teams can propose that to us and we can have that conversation. Next slide, please. These are some examples of the types of initiatives that teams might propose, onto which they would add that innovation. So I want to be clear here that all of these projects, all of the initiatives that teams might propose need to include minimum technologies of efficient electric heating and cooling. So either including heat pumps and or heat pump water installations in all of the addressed buildings, as well as weatherization and envelope improvements where those are needed to reduce energy costs. So some examples of partnerships and teaming that might be a part of a team's initiative would be a rural electric cooperative that might partner with a local CBO to address low and moderate income single family residences that are currently running on propane and transition those homes to efficient electric heat pumps. Another example might be a community-based organization working with a mid-sized local government in a mid-sized town, trying to address all of the affordable housing buildings that are owned by the local affordable housing agency, and upgrading those buildings and installing efficient electric equipment. I'll stop there with the examples, but you can see a number of other examples that include many buildings that could be a part of an upgrade initiative. Next slide, please. Great. So we're really seeking, again, those non-technical innovations, addressing those non-technical barriers. lack of contractor familiarity with technologies, the costs that are associated with doing these upgrades and figuring out how to use existing and forthcoming rebates from IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other legislation, as well as utility rebates and other monies to stack and help pay for those retrofits. So really looking to these initiatives to be creative and innovative in their solutions to address some of these non-technical barriers. Next slide, please. I mentioned that application support prize overview, or the application support prize. This is another overview of that. We do have funds to support 50 winners of this prize, which is $5,000 and 10 hours of technical assistance, which is actually provided by Elevate, one of our partners on this call today. The last application round is open until April 26th. So if you're interested in pursuing application support, please think about applying before April 26th. And there are a number of webinars coming up that detail that support and how to apply for it. Next slide, please. Great. So again, there's the QR code and the HeroX URL to check out all of the material for the Buildings Upgrade Prize. You can register for upcoming informational webinars. You can create an account and follow the prize by that red arrow. There's a follow button on the main page, and that will give you updates automatically about the prize. So encourage folks to check that out and consider applying. I think that's my last slide. Yes. All right. So back over to you, Angelina.
Thank you, Holly. We really appreciate that overview. And if you have questions, I saw one pop up. We will reserve questions until the end, so keep those questions in mind. But with that, we're going to dive into today's topic, accessing funding sources for affordable housing and equity-eligible commercial building retrofits. As I mentioned, my name is Angelina Benson-Glanz, and I'm the Principal Director of Special Projects at Elevate. Elevate's a nonprofit that seeks to co-create a world in which everyone has clean, affordable heat, power, and water in their homes and communities. As a nonprofit, we work collaboratively with communities, governments, housing providers, diverse contractors, and nonprofit partners across the country to transition to just and equitable clean energy solutions. Our programs span energy and health retrofits, solar and storage, smart grid, contractor and workforce development, and community engagement. Over the past 20 years, we have retrofit over 100,000 affordable housing units. We believe the people and communities that have been most impacted by climate change are the same ones that have been historically marginalized, and they must be at the center of the design and implementation of solutions. So a little bit more about me. At Elevate, I lead the design and implementation of the Justice 40 Accelerator, a collaborative with Partnership for Southern Equity, the Solutions Project, Groundswell, Hummingbird, and People's Climate Innovation Center. And through the Accelerator, we support climate and environmental justice organizations to build their capacity and partnerships, as well as readiness to access government funding to implement their climate solutions in their communities. As Holly mentioned, Elevate is also a partner on R2E2, Residential Retrofits for Energy Equity, a new nationwide initiative that provides trainings to state, local, and tribal governments, as well as community-based organizations and other partners to jumpstart energy upgrades for affordable housing that will lower utility bills, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve residents' health, create good-paying local jobs, and help advance racial equity. R2E2 is supporting the Buildings Upgrade Prize, which Holly talked about, by providing training and technical assistance to applicants and awardees. So as Holly walked through the Buildings Upgrade Prize and also mentioned that much of today's webinar is applicable and important information to as you're developing your applications. So just real quick, for the Buildings Upgrade Prize, teams will submit applications composed of narratives addressing these 5 scoring criteria on the right side. these in their concept plans. And in their concept plans will then be scored based on how strongly reviewers agree with the scoring statements. This webinar today is particularly relevant for scoring statements number 2, 3, and 4 in bold. So just as an example, for criterion number 2, the building upgrade initiative addresses identified challenges with innovations that can deliver significant results, such as funding combinations and financing to reduce upfront costs. For criteria number 4, the team includes expertise in accessing and combining multiple sources of funding to resource initiatives and activities. So just wanted to give you a couple examples to keep in the back of your mind of the information you'll be learning today and how it could be applicable in your applications for the Buildings Upgrade Prize. So just a quick overview of what we'll cover today. We'll talk about braiding versus blending funds. We'll give an overview of types, sources, and categories of funding that can be braided. We'll provide an overview of federal funding, as well as an overview of state, local, and other non-government funding sources. I'll also walk through an example of a building upgrade program that braided funding, and then we'll close out with key takeaways, some important resources, and as I mentioned, we'll leave time for questions that are submitted through the Q&A function. Before we dive any deeper into today's conversation, though, we'd like to better understand your current level of comfort or experience utilizing multiple funding sources. So as you've seen, a poll has popped up on your screen, and we would love to, oh, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong slide. I skipped over a slide. We had to, here we go. So we'd love to understand who all's in the room with us today. So as you saw, the Zoom poll popped up on your screen. We'd just love to understand, how do you describe the organization you represent? Do you work with a local government or municipal government, a community-based organization that's not a 501c3, a community-based organization that is a 501c3, an education organization, public housing, small business, for-profit? Please select one, and we look forward to seeing the results. Just give you a few minutes. Okay. Great. So about a third local municipal government, almost 40% community-based organizations. Wonderful. A couple small businesses. This is great. A few education, public housing organizations, and for-profits. Wonderful. Thank you. Now, jumping to the next poll. Sorry, I jumped ahead, but we'd like to better understand your comfort level or experience utilizing multiple funding sources. Is it new to you? Do you have some level of experience and comfort, or are you pretty well versed in this topic? Love to see just kind of where you are going into today's presentation. Okay, over 50%, it's new to you. Awesome, welcome. We're glad you're here. About 40% have some level of comfort experience, and a few feel very well versed. So thank you, thank you. So with that, let's jump into the meat of today's conversation. What does it mean to braid funds? Braiding funding means bringing together multiple funding sources to support the total cost of a program or project in pursuit of a common goal. For example, later in today's presentation, I'll share more about a program that Elevate and our partners implement in Wisconsin that's focused on delivering energy and health and safety upgrades in naturally occurring affordable housing. The implementation of this program that I'll go deeper into was made possible by braiding 9 funding sources, and each funding source supported different aspects of the program and project costs. So it's just really important to understand with braiding funding that each individual funding stream is distinct and requires separate tracking and reporting. Please know there is no one-size-fits-all approach to braiding funding. Your approach will be very dependent on the available funding sources and the project costs that need to be covered. So to braid funding sources, first, it's really important to identify the available funding streams. Second, it's really important to identify who are the eligible communities, building types, building upgrades that can be served or delivered, and what are the other key aspects of the program or project requirements that you're trying to fund. Next, determine where there's alignment in the requirements of the funding sources and the needs of your project and program. Then develop shared goals and a plan for how to braid the funds. Ensure that you have the appropriate governance and collaboration structures in place to oversee the use of the funds, but also to meet the tracking and reporting requirements of each of the funding sources, and also meet the needs of the partners involved. And then lastly, identify and fill the remaining gaps that are needed to really implement the program or project. We also want to touch on blending funding. So this is slightly different from braiding funding. Blending combines funding from a variety of sources into one pot to cover the costs of a project or program. When blending funding into one pot, it can be challenging to then track and report on the uses of the specific funding stream. So that's just really important to note. Instead, reporting is often at the program or project level. And also it's important to know that when blending funding, the most restrictive rules across the various funding sources then have to be applied to all of the funding to make sure that you stay in alignment. So blending offers more flexibility than braiding. And so that said, braiding is often easier due to statutory requirements on the funding sources. In my experience, I've seen blending funding occurring with philanthropic general program support dollars. It's more difficult with federal funding, for example. So now let's walk through the various types of funding that are available out there. Since we talked about the Buildings Up prize earlier, we're going to start with prizes. So prizes are awarded for work that's already occurred, or prize monies are intended to help fund work to be completed for continued participation in prize phases. Prize monies do not need to be paid back, but they are different from grants in that they do not require the same level of tracking and reporting. So for example, with the Buildings Upgrade Prize, winners receive prize monies for their concept plans and their applications, and there will be no oversight of how the funds are actually spent after they're awarded. However, to advance to further prize phases and receive additional funding and support, teams will need to demonstrate that they have made progress laying the groundwork of their concept plans and are ready to move into the pilot phase. Grants are funding that is received that does not need to be paid back. And that being said, grants often do have certain restrictions on eligibility. They require an application process many times on the front end, and then they do have tracking and reporting requirements to the funder. And those could be intermediate, in the middle of the grant cycle, as well as near the end. In some cases, funds are dispersed upfront. In other cases, they're dispersed at regular intervals, and all of that's outlined in the grant agreement. By contrast, loans are funding that needs to be paid back over time. They involve an application process that demonstrates financial ability to repay the loan. Loans can come from government agencies, nonprofits, financial institutions, a variety of places. Incentives, discounts, and rebates are another form of funding that can help offset project implementation costs, but they often do not cover the full cost of the project. So a really important source of funding to braid in and layer into your projects. And then lastly, in-kind services, similar to technical assistance or other types of services that can be received, can be utilized to help run and implement your program. So now a little bit about funding categories. It's really important to have a holistic view of the various funding sources to support your projects. What I found is that You may be working on an energy efficiency project, but when you look holistically, you'll see there's a need for electrification, health and safety, a variety of things. So really keep an open mind when you're looking for funding sources. It's also what we've listed here on this slide. We just wanted to really touch on this long list of funding categories can be used for the implementation of building improvements. And what we've highlighted in the top category are the ones that are directly applicable to the Buildings Upgrade Prize. So that includes energy efficiency, building electrification, environmental justice, affordable housing and renewable energy, health and safety, workforce development. All of these funding categories are directly applicable to the Buildings Upgrade Prize. But nonetheless, we also encourage you to consider other funding categories that are of interest and those that would help alleviate building improvement challenges seen in your geographic area. Just wanted to touch on kind of the highest priorities for the Buildings Upgrade Prize. So diving a little bit deeper into where are these sources of funding coming from, right? So government is a large category: federal, state, local government. That could include city or county. Utilities often offer incentives or rebates for equipment. Sometimes they even offer loans. So definitely take a look to see what your utilities have available. Foundations offer grants. These grants, depending on the foundation and the scope of your project, could be used for specific project costs, for administration. Definitely explore. Nonprofits provide grants. They also provide direct services and technical assistance. Also note, nonprofits can include community development financial institutions, also called CDFIs. So CDFIs have more of a mission and are working in a variety of communities. And then lastly, commercial banks and private investors, they can offer loans. Sometimes they offer project equity. So just another funding source to be considered in your projects. So let's dive deeper into federal funding. When evaluating federal funding opportunities, it's important to understand how federal funding flows. So this graphic on the left-hand side of the screen is really meant to illustrate how federal funding can flow from to the state government, and that could be through formula or discretionary funding. And the difference is that formula funding specifies the disbursement of funding based on a formula. The formula can be measured based on population density, poverty rate, unemployment rate, percentage of low-income families, senior citizens, individuals with disabilities, a wide range. Depends on the funding source, but it's definitely prescribed based on a formula. Discretionary means a grant or funding source that is awarded based on an application and merit and eligibility. So keep in mind, states don't, they get the formula funding directly. The discretionary funding they still have to apply for. And the same thing goes for local government. They can receive funding at a formula or discretionary funding. And then the third arrow coming out of the federal government is funding that goes directly towards individuals or business entities. Please keep in mind, business entities could also include nonprofit organizations or community-based organizations, just kind of a broad definition there. So those individuals or business entities can receive discretionary funding from the federal government, as well as from state or local government. So this graphic's trying to just illustrate how the funding can flow. It's important to keep in mind that there are a variety of agencies, especially that have funding available for building upgrades. Obviously, Department of Energy, as we heard from Holly, environmental protection, housing and urban development, and USDA, the Department of Agriculture, is one that we definitely want to touch on. They have a wide range of opportunities as well through their rural development program. So definitely take a look at those. And of course, the Internal Revenue Service, which is popping up especially because some of the new tax credits, which we'll touch on. So who's actually eligible for federal funding? Government agencies and organizations, as I mentioned, state, local. tribal governments as well, education organizations, so institutions of higher education, public school districts, and private institutions of higher education as well, public housing, as well as nonprofit organizations. And this could include nonprofits with the 501c3 status and as well as others. So, and then for-profit organizations, obviously, and small businesses. And it's important to note there's a specific definition for small businesses. So if you have a small business, make sure to see if you apply, because there's going to be some funding specific for you. So a few key considerations when thinking about federal funding. First and foremost, federal funding scopes are specific to certain activities, products, and services. Those outside of the federal funding scope will require other funding sources. So federal funding is very specific. It's really important to carefully define project scopes to what can be achieved within the time and budget provided by the funding. It's also important to take time to define the procedures to ensure funding requirements will be met. And then lastly, it's important to allocate sufficient resources and time to track and report back to funding agencies. It takes time. It takes time, and you want to make sure that you have the staff on board to do that. As many of you know, there's been a lot of recent legislation that has really opened the door to new funding sources for building upgrades. And some of the legislations even increased the amount of funding for existing pots. So through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA. There's a lot of acronyms out there. I'm going to try to minimize the use of them, but so these have just kind of really opened up the door. This is a slide that provides a table of a few of the rebates and tax credits that are now going to be available, as well as some funding from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, for affordable housing. So for example, the homes rebate will provide $2,000 to $4,000 for whole home retrofit projects. This amount actually doubles for households below 80% area median income. So we're really excited about this, this opportunity, these rebates. There's still a lot of decisions and rules and all of that good stuff being determined, but please keep an eye out. And these rebates, the funding will actually flow from the federal government to the states, and then it will be distributed. So it's one of those, in fact, the 3 DOE programs that we have listed here are actually all allocated to the states based on formulas. The HUD and EPA programs are competitive discretionary funding sources. So just wanted to highlight a few of these here. Gus will be putting into the chat the link so that you can open it up, take a look as well. And also keep in mind that EPA has $5 billion for climate pollution reduction grants and $3 billion for environmental justice block grants. So lots of funding becoming available. Another funding source that is actually quite imminent, it closes this week, is the EPA Environmental Justice Collaborative Problem Solving Cooperative Agreement. So it's, as you can see here, $25 million for CBOs, proposing projects up to $500K, and another $5 million for smaller CBOs, proposing smaller projects. So hopefully this one has been on your radar and you have your applications ready to submit. But we're also really looking forward to learning more about the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that is going to be coming out later this summer. So more guidance coming. Definitely stay tuned. And then there are a variety of other funding opportunities. We've just touched on a few here, and I really want to highlight one of the resources that's hyperlinked that Gus will also be dropping into the chat, and that is the selective federal funding and TA sources for building upgrades. This is a wonderful table that lists by entity the different funding and TA opportunities, such as the homes rebate, other rebates, and a tax credit. So as Gus drops that into the chat, I encourage you to open it and take a look and save it for future reference too. So now on to non-federal government funding sources. So this includes state and local government. So, again, state and local government funding can flow to individuals and business entities in a variety of forms. There's also other non-government sources, such as utilities, philanthropy, private financing, and nonprofits. We're going to take each of these, one at a time. So state governments are offering tax credits, deductions, sales tax exemptions, other funding sources. The main thing is to definitely take a look at your state agency websites for more information. Same thing with local government. Lots of funding that's flowing, more to come. So definitely go on to state agency and local agency websites. Many of them, I'm starting to see more of them have listservs that you can sign up for to get information, especially about funding flowing through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. In terms of others like utilities, nonprofit, CDFIs, take a look at your local utility websites, get in touch with individuals working at the utility. We have here on the slide a list of CDFIs. Again, these slides will be sent out. And then philanthropic organizations and nonprofits, really go to the foundation's websites to understand what they fund and if it's a good fit for your projects. Sorry, I'm gonna just jump back. Okay, we got another Zoom poll. What funding sources is your organization already working with? And this is a multi-select, so select all that apply. Government, including federal, state, and local, utilities, philanthropy, commercial financing, nonprofits. If there's others, you can drop them into the chat, let us know. Just leave the poll open for a short period of time. Great, a lot of government. 83% of you are working with government funding. That's great. And a pretty even mix of the remaining. That's wonderful. I definitely encourage you to take a look at what else is out there in terms of philanthropy, utilities. The goal is to really braid all these together. So just wanted to touch a little bit on, because we wanted to cover affordable housing and equity eligible commercial buildings. And it's important to keep in mind, for some funding opportunities for commercial buildings, affordable housing is also included. But here we wanted to just provide a list of some other funding that might not be on your radar and it might be worth considering as you're thinking about your building upgrades. And those are energy savings agreements or ESAs or energy efficiency performance contracts. Kind of go by different terms, have slightly, some nuances. Energy efficiency as a service is another one. Equipment leasing arrangements, power purchase agreements are something that are very common for solar. And then tenant green leases are something else that's used in the commercial building space. So definitely keep those in mind. And at the end of the presentation, we'll also have some additional resources where you could learn more. And I've touched on utility programs a little bit. So here we just kind of wanted to outline some of the pros and cons of using some of this funding. So many states have mandated or voluntary utility programs that provide incentives for energy upgrades in buildings. So these offer, incentives, rebates that help lower the upfront cost. In some cases, they actually do offer equipment for free or installations at a free or low cost. Keep in mind they're funded over multi-years, which is nice, but you want to understand the fine print of what happens when funding runs out. But a few of the downsides is there really is limited availability, no guarantees of access, and sometimes there are restrictions on fuel switching, which is it's a challenge when we're trying to electrify buildings. So philanthropy, there are a wide variety of national and regional family and corporate foundations that are out there that are looking to fund this type of work. It's very flexible funding in many cases. It can be multi-year, and it can help with covering some of the costs that government funding is not able to cover. So it's something to keep in mind. And in some cases, whenever there's investment capital, it is usually low cost capital. One limitation of philanthropy is depending on the foundation, it might be geographically limited. It might vary from region to region, and there can be very specific funding cycles that you have to adhere to. And so that's just a challenge to keep in mind, but it's important to still explore the opportunities that are out there. I'm definitely starting to see more flexible, community-focused philanthropy becoming available, especially focused on building upgrades, climate change, etc. And then, you know, sometimes with philanthropy, their priorities change. I think right now there's a huge push and emphasis on the work that many of us are doing around focused on building upgrades, lower income communities that have been marginalized, etc. And I think, you know, just again, we run a program that highlight later that uses philanthropic funding being braided in. We have other programs that are utilizing philanthropy to cover building electrification needs. So highly recommend exploring what's available. Private financing, again, pros and cons, you know, can really help move projects forward. It's readily available for qualified borrowers. The limitation on that is that qualifications may be unrealistic and for some building owners. And, you know, there's multiple options in the market, but there also can be some limitations in terms of it increases overall project cost. It has to be paid back. Green financing is sometimes it's not readily available. It's still a work in progress. And that's why we're really looking forward to the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund coming out soon. I've touched on community development financial institutions a bit, but they do provide capital. In Chicago, there's a CDFI called Community Investment Corporation, and they actually have provided many loans for energy efficiency upgrades and really have an outstanding program that we've collaborated with them on over the years at Elevate. So many CDFIs are nonprofit lenders. They are really trying to make funding accessible to affordable housing owners. That being said, some may not have funded energy upgrades before, and so it's a learning curve and there's some limitations. We also wanted to include just a quick snapshot of there are some examples of how health funding has been braided in to specific building upgrade projects. So want to show you some of these examples. Again, we'll send out these slides so you can click on these links and learn a little bit more because these are some really outstanding examples. And here's a few more, including a program from NYSERDA in New York. So now to just really touch on an example of the program that I've referenced a few times. In Madison, Wisconsin, Elevate and many partners launched the Wisconsin Efficiency Navigator program. And here's just some of our stats for this program and a little bit more about it. It's really a program focused on small to medium size multifamily housing owners and residents, and the goal is really to make the housing more efficient and resilient. We really want to foster innovation and preserve affordable workforce housing. We're really focused on equity and addressing the intersection of environmental, social, and economic justice, particularly understanding that residents are already cost burdened. So how can we alleviate that? And then lastly, of course, we want to have an impact on climate change and reduce the energy and water demand in our existing stock. We know that buildings take up contribute such a large percentage to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're really striving to reduce that. So in 2020, when this program really got underway, within that 1 year, 95 units were assessed, 50 plus opportunities for solar were identified with over 360 kW in potential. On average, 15 energy and water measures were recommended per building. 35 plus focus on energy multifamily in-unit efficiency upgrades were done. And so Focus on Energy is the state of Wisconsin's energy efficiency program. And we're seeing results of 10 to 20% of savings and identifying over $150,000 in incentives. So this was a small scale program, but just wanted to highlight it because this is the one that I mentioned where we braided together 9 funding sources. And here's the full list. So we used philanthropy to cover administrative costs. There was some American Rescue Plan Act money that was utilized for the building upgrades, or planned to be utilized, as well as some community development block grant, weatherization assistance programs, an energy innovation grant program through the Wisconsin Office of Energy and Innovation was also used to cover the building upgrades. There's a nonprofit partner that was brought in that provided a grant to help address some of the lead and mold concerns in the building. So we were looking at not only energy and water efficiency and weatherization, but also health and safety. And then, as I mentioned, we utilized utility incentives and rebates and some free equipment from Focus on Energy, Madison Water Utility, and Madison Metro Sewer or Sewage District. So just gives you a sense of it takes a lot to braid all these funding sources together, but it really can result in a holistic program. So just to start to wrap up, I think it's really important as we think about what are the key takeaways, what are the next steps for you as you're really starting to think about now, how do you do this for your projects? There's a variety of online federal and non-federal resources to gain familiarity with terminology and processes. Highly recommend checking out grants.gov. There's some real great tutorials there. The Justice 40 Accelerator, if you go to justice40accelerator.org on the website, there's data and tools that we've kind of just pulled together a list of what we've found out there that are great resources to help learn. And so definitely recommend checking those out. There's also some free grant platforms where you can learn more in grant management information and webinars. We also recommend signing up for listservs to stay up to date on information. Check out your state agencies, local agency websites, also federal agencies. I know none of us want more emails, but I'm really finding these emails to actually be beneficial just to hear what's the latest and greatest from all the variety of agencies, what new funding opportunities are coming out. So encourage you to start tracking opportunities. And we've also provided some more resources on the subsequent slides. And then next, really start to identify your project scope and the definitions and what's your budget, timeline, all of that. And then start to get your organizations ready to meet the requirements to apply for. Particularly the federal, state, and local funding is going to have quite a few requirements and processes and procedures, things that you just need in place. So encourage you to begin doing that. So here's a list of resources for federal funding opportunities. Again, we'll send these out. And some more, as I mentioned, the grants.gov Learning Center. There's quite a few maps. We also included the Justice 40 Accelerator website here. And just to retouch on the selected federal funding and technical assistance sources for building upgrades, highly recommend checking out this Airtable. So we will make sure you get all these slides. And then, so lastly, we just wanted to pose the question, what additional information or resources do you need to increase your comfort level with braiding funding sources? So, where do you still have questions? Select all that apply. What would you be interested in exploring more of? Just give you a minute to answer this poll. Let's check out the results. The nuances, there are many. So this was just scratching the surface today. So types of funding available both at the federal, state, local, and philanthropic level. It's great. Some more case studies and additional funding resources, and then potential next steps. Great, thank you for answering that. And with that, we just wanted to let you know about the upcoming webinars. There's still quite a few more. Please check them out. I'll leave the QR code up for a second so you can scan it to get the additional details and register. And then in addition to these additional upcoming webinars, there will also be office hours. So office hours are intended to be a space where organizations can come and ask questions regarding the specifics of the topics. The office hour for today's webinar will be on May 2nd at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. So if you have follow-up questions that don't get answered today, bring them to the office hours. And with that, we want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I know this was a lot of information, but really just wanted to touch on, how do you even start to think about braiding funding sources? And with that, we will open it up for Q&A. So thank you.
Angelina, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Conant, and I'm with the R2E2 initiative at ACEEE. And we'll be going into the Q&A portion of the webinar today and have plenty of time left. So please make sure that you're entering all of your questions for both Angelina and Holly into the Q&A function. And we should have time to get to all of them, which is great. So we'll invite Holly back up here and start with some questions related to the Buildings Upgrade Prize. So first question from Brett, are there size limits for teams? And are pre-existing nonprofits able to apply as one team?
No and yes. So we do not have size limits in terms of how large the teams are. We're really encouraging multidisciplinary teams. We do have some requirements in terms of the types of team members that are either required or recommended, depending on the pathway that teams choose to pursue. And that's all listed in our rules document. But I won't quote the rules directly, but our equity-centered pathway does require team participation from a community-based organization that represents the building occupants for buildings that might be upgraded in that initiative, as well as, I believe, a team member with funding, grading expertise. I think that's a recommended team member. And that's all detailed very clearly in the rules document on the HeroX website.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Elena. Do you need to include both efficient electric heating and cooling equipment in your Buildings Up application, or can you just address one or the other?
So we state heat pumps and or heat pump water heaters need to be a part of the building upgrade. I'm not sure if the question is asking if the heat pump has to do both heating and cooling, or if you have to include a heat pump and a heat pump water heater. So if there's already existing air conditioning in a building, we wouldn't require teams to rip out the existing air conditioning if it's functioning in electric. Certainly the heat pump that goes in could provide both if needed at a later point. If that answers the question about having to do heating and cooling. The question about heat pumps and or heat pump water heaters, it is one and or the other. So an initiative may be focused on installing heat pumps in buildings. It may be focused on just doing heat pump water heaters, or it may have offerings for both.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there's a little bit more detail. They have electric cooling in the buildings they're considering including in their building upgrade zone, but are still using natural gas heating. So would they also need to switch from natural gas to electric to qualify?
Well, I think if you're using natural gas heating and you're putting in a heat pump, that would replace the natural gas heating. And that is a portion of, of the goal of this initiative is to prepare buildings to transition to be able to use renewable electricity as the grid greens. So, yes.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Esmeralda. Are there additional phases in the buildings upgrade prize for new teams to apply to, or for phase 1 selected teams to continue to participate in?
Yes, so we do anticipate Buildings Up to have 4 phases over about 5 years. So phase 1 is open now. We anticipate that phase 2 will open next fall, and teams that are accepted into phase 1 are the only teams that can continue into phase 2. So if you'd like to participate in the program, then this is the time. That said, I also said that we're looking at 20 to 60 teams, selecting 20 to 60 teams. So it is possible that in future we may have another round of phase 1, depending on how many teams we admit this summer. And I always need to give the caveat that these are all dependent on congressional funding and approvals. So right now we have approvals through phase 1, and we're hoping that we will have continued funding for the additional phases.
Yes, hope so. Another question. Yes. Another question related to the phasing over the duration of the prize program. Are teams that receive a cash prize and technical assistance in phase 1 or selected as phase 1 winners required to proceed to phase 2, or can they not continue past phase 1 in the prize?
Right, participation in additional phases is not required. We certainly hope that teams will choose to continue and move through the additional plan and pilot and implement phases. And we do anticipate similar funding. So at each of those phase milestones, similar funding being available to the team. So the $200,000 and the $400,000 continuing as additional cash prizes at those phases. So we hope that will be inspiration for teams to continue, and that will help teams have a nice runway to develop initiatives that are self-sustaining after that.
And this is probably a good follow-up on what you were just speaking to from Valerie, but do the prize monies associated with this prize cover engineering, cover implementation of upgrades, or how do you see teams really using the funds that will be awarded?
That's one of the things that we really like about the prize structure, is that teams are awarded cash prizes and they are able to choose how they use those funds. We certainly recognize that $200,000 and $400,000 isn't going to buy a whole bunch of heat pumps or heat pump water heaters. That's not going to be able to pay for the building upgrades that the initiatives will undertake, especially at the scale and the number that we're hoping to see from teams. This is really meant as a capacity building prize that will help teams, fund staff and get started and develop their initiatives, maybe work with consultants, maybe support community engagement in the communities where they want to work. But the prize does not have specific requirements for how you use the funds. In the end, it's up to the teams.
Great. Next question from Nicole about team composition. do CBOs need to have a member or representative enrolled on the team that registers on HeroX, or is a letter of support and identifying the CBO as a team member in the submission materials sufficient?
Yes, I think what is in the submission that is due on July 18th is what will be reviewed by our reviewers. So it would be important to show participation and significant involvement from a community-based organization at that point.
And that might have been getting at the lead applicant nuance of teams that are submitting applications. Did you have any additional clarifications around lead applicant being a CBO or not to provide?
I think, Carolyn, I'll have to provide that in follow-up just so that I'm sure to give the right answer.
Okay, and just to clarify for everybody, we'll be posting follow-up answers and answers that we've gone through during this Q&A on HeroX after the webinar. So you can look for unanswered questions and answered questions there. A last couple of buildings up questions. One from Brad: if you're installing a heat pump, do you have to fully replace the fossil heating that is already there, or can you use the heat pump to supplement the other source of heat? In other words, is it okay to retain backup gas appliances if you're installing efficient electric heating equipment?
Yes, but it's okay to use the gas as backup. But the new efficient electric equipment should be sustaining most of the load, and the existing equipment should be only used as backup.
Great. And Robin is wondering where they can find the definition for equity eligible commercial buildings.
That is outlined in great detail in the rules document. I think it's section 3.2, if I'm not mistaken, where we outline exactly what qualifies. And again, if there are things that we missed and you have buildings that, there we go, 3.5, I was close. If there are buildings that teams feel should have been included in the equity eligible buildings, and you can make a great case for why that is, we are certainly open to that.
And there is a specific allowance for that in the official definition that teams are able to suggest a locally appropriate definition of equity eligible buildings as well. And you'll find the link to the rules document that contains that definition a little bit earlier in the chat. How are these projects, or how can these projects address outdoor air ventilation, or possibly also improvements to indoor air quality? Question from Matthew.
Yeah, so the outdoor air ventilation, I'm not sure about that response, but indoor air quality is more applicable if you're doing other kinds of replacements, such as moving from a gas stove to an efficient electric induction stove, where you won't have the combustion in the home. That's where we're starting to see research about indoor air quality that's fairly significant. I would need to defer on the question about outdoor exhaust, or not sure what the first part was there, Carolyn.
Addressing outdoor air ventilation, so possibly could be related to air sealing and envelope improvement measures that are keeping outdoor pollutants from entering the home. Just before this call started, we were talking about all of our experiences with wildfire seasons in the past. So that's certainly a great opportunity to improve climate resilience and health of occupants by doing those air sealing and envelope improvements.
And that's always, a delicate dance, because the tighter you make your home, you also have to be careful that you're not trapping indoor pollutants in the house that can't get out. So that's why it is really important to have that, fresh air coming in and ventilation.
Next question is from Lucina. Not every climate zone combined with the overall efficiency of buildings is suitable for heat pumps, and upgrades that address building envelopes are already very challenging. So why is the heat pump component required for the prize?
That is the focus of this prize. We're really looking for creative and innovative solutions for transitioning our buildings to be able to accept that clean, increasingly clean energy from the grid, which is electric energy. And so that's really the focus of this prize. And I will note that you're very correct that not every location in the country do all of these types of equipment make sense. So that's an important piece that teams are going to be asked to analyze in their beginning in their concept plans, but definitely if they're accepted into phase one, if they're a phase one winner and they move into phase two, that's some of the technical assistance that will be provided to teams, is looking at, does the equipment that you're proposing make sense in your climate zone? And is it going to reduce energy costs and energy burden for residents? And if not, you need to look at other solutions, and that will be part of technical assistance.
Great. A couple of questions about equity eligible buildings and Justice 40 designations for communities where these projects might take place. Do equity eligible buildings have to be located in J40 census tracts? And how do we find out whether our communities are eligible, equity eligible for J40 funding, etc.?
Yes, so no, equity eligible buildings do not have to be located in Justice 40 census tracts. That's one of the four kind of buckets that we showed on the earlier slides. There are a number of different ways that buildings could qualify as equity eligible, and that is outlined in that section 3.5 in the rules. We also have a tool, and I don't believe we've posted it publicly yet, but we are developing a tool that helps map not just the Justice 40 census tracts, but also Title I schools, as well as other equity eligible areas and affordable housing across the United States. So you can go in and use this tool and kind of zoom into your what we're calling your building upgrade zone, where you think your building upgrade zone might be, and see which buildings are either in Justice 40 census tracts or might be designated affordable housing, disadvantaged businesses. You can really get in there and get addresses for those buildings. So that is a resource that, if it's not already up under the resources tab on the HeroX website, it will be shortly.
And we do also have an upcoming webinar specifically on different tools and databases and mapping sources that people can use to help identify their building upgrade zone. So I encourage you to attend that webinar for more ideas about how to identify priority communities to include in your building upgrade zone.
And Carolyn, I'll just add that we actually held a webinar 10 days or 2 weeks ago about some of these tools that was just focused on tools. So, how do you determine what might be the best technologies to use in your building upgrade zone? We also demoed this mapping tool, which is under development. So that recording is up under the webinars page on Buildings Up and can be accessible. You can see those 3 tools that are highlighted. And those can be really helpful to teams right now while you're putting together concept plans for Buildings Up.
Great. I'm going to just take one more question about Buildings Up for now to make sure that we have plenty of time for the funding specific questions. So last question, for naturally occurring affordable housing, would it be sufficient to only do improvements in housing units with LMI or low and moderate income occupants, or would we need to target mortgage or rental levels that overlap with HUD or subsidized affordable housing levels?
That is a question I can't respond to off the top of my head. I think that both would be okay, but let us look into that and we'll respond separately.
And this was
glad to hear these detailed questions, though. I'm glad people are really thinking about what this would look like to be a team. So great.
Yes, it's great to see all the interest in the Buildings Upgrade Prize and all the specific questions. And Nicole, R2E2 will be playing a large role in helping with the technical assistance for teams that are focusing on affordable housing for their retrofit projects. And we're excited to work with teams that are focusing both on naturally occurring affordable housing as well as subsidized affordable housing. And it doesn't have to be both in the same application necessarily either. So not sure if that gets to your question, but naturally occurring affordable housing certainly is an eligible building type that we'll be working with in the prize. All right. Thanks so much for all those buildings up questions, and thanks for fielding all of those answers, Holly. We'll move over to some questions that are specific to the accessing funding sources part of the webinar that Angelina led us through. First question from Tom, could you please discuss some funding solutions that help to address the tenant-landlord split incentive?
Yeah, a really, really great and important question. In many cases, we are currently using philanthropic dollars to help lower the investment required by building owners so that they will actually make the conversion, for example, to electrify their building without incurring significant costs. We're also acutely aware of how, for example, electrification could raise tenant bills. And so we're looking at solar to help offset some of that. And right now there's, more solar incentives coming down the pipeline and everything. So it's a really great question. I feel like there's no silver bullet. And I think we're all in this field trying to figure out what are the options and how can we get creative? How can we layer on, for example, these rebates that are coming down the pipeline, which ones can be applicable for a building owner to use to make upgrades in their units. So no silver bullet, got to explore what are all the funding opportunities out there and see what we can make work.
Yeah, still waiting for that silver bullet, but great question. Thank you, Tom. Next question from Natalie. Are there any databases that you could recommend that combine available funding sources or make suggestions for how others might combine funding sources for a specific type of project?
Yeah, also a really good question. Like, I'm not aware of a database that says like you can combine, this funding source with this one for this purpose. I think some of the case studies and examples that were included in today's presentation, I would recommend checking out. I think there are some databases out there that have a list of funding sources that we definitely would recommend checking out too. But yeah, it's a good question, and I think just posing it, plants the seed that it'd be really wonderful if we had a better sense of, even like the federal agencies, if you could say, and some we're starting to see are saying this can be layered in with XYZ funding or it cannot, and even that guidance on what cannot be layered in is really helpful too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is such a tough topic, and obviously one webinar isn't enough to make us all experts in combining funding sources, but we are anticipating that a lot of the technical assistance requests that will come from teams participating in the Buildings Upgrade Prize will be related to assistance identifying potential funding sources, and also all of those different types of restrictions and considerations that Angelina talked about during the webinar for which ones can be effectively combined to support your projects. So just know that you won't be alone in that. And although we're not sure of this database existing or not at this time, that we'll be ready to provide a lot of technical assistance to help teams with that very question. Next question, where can I look for funding sources from philanthropic entities or foundations or nonprofit organizations? Do you know of any specific websites that are clearinghouses for those available funds that we should be looking at or applying to?
Yeah. This is something that we're in regular conversations about. Through the Justice 40 Accelerator, we have started to create a database of what's out there specific to climate and clean energy and environmental justice funding. And so looking at all sources, federal, state sources that become available come across our radar, as well as the philanthropic and others. So definitely would recommend checking out our website. And as we become aware of others that are doing this, recommend checking them out. There's some really great organizations out there like Environmental Protection Network and Anthropocene Alliance. So a couple organizations that are helping to also serve as a clearinghouse in a way and just get information to their members. So consider those. And then there are grant platforms out there. Some are paid, some are free. Something like Open Grants has, is also trying to become a larger clearinghouse of information. Just Fund is another one. So just tossing out a couple names. So there are some out there that, can be helpful. Yeah, still would love to have everything in one place. And of course, gotta say grants.gov is going to have the vast majority of federal funding.
Great, thank you for those suggestions. Question from Jamie. We have never applied to EPA before and are considering the use of professional grant writers for this type of funding application. Is there a list of recommended grant writers somewhere?
Answered this in the Q&A just because I dropped in a link. There is a grant professionals association that does have a list that you can search, and also recommended to Jamie to just reach out to us at the Justice 40 Accelerator, and we're happy to provide the recommendations of the grant writers that we work with and that our cohort organizations work with. So it's exciting that you're embarking on this journey, and highly recommend working with a grant writer, grant management professional.
Yes, very specific skill set. Could you explain a little bit more about what CDFIs are and why teams might want to work with them to access funding for retrofit projects?
Yeah, really great question. So CDFIs are specialized financial institutions that provide financial products and services to populations and businesses located in underserved markets. So they are federally insured and regulated depository institutions, but they have a primary mission of community development. And so that's really important, especially when thinking about some of the underserved and underrepresented communities that many of us are working in and supporting and uplifting. So these institutions have a reputation of responsible lending into these underserved communities. They have lower barriers and also sometimes lower interest rates. There's a whole level of detail that I could get into about the mechanics of it, but definitely encourage you to Google, find out a little bit more, see which CDFIs are in your local area and serve your local area, and connect with them to learn more. They really are good institutions to consider engaging with on these types of projects, just because they have that mission focused.
Yeah, and as a specific example from my own experience, before coming to ACEEE, I worked for a municipal electric utility in northern Colorado, city of Fort Collins, and we partnered with a CDFI to be the loan administrators for our on-bill loan that was available for homeowners and rental property owners who were pursuing building upgrades. So they were wonderful to work with, and I think that that mission alignment really helped make it a positive experience for both sides, as well as for the customers that we were serving.
Oh, great. I just wanted to uplift someone in the chat mentioned that Foundation Center, now part of Candide, lists all the grants, the grant giving organizations in the country. Thank you for putting that in the chat, Katie. So just another resource.
We've got a couple of great questions, in the face of this overwhelming amount of funding sources and different potential avenues for looking for and applying for and accessing funds to support the work. How can we keep things moving smoothly in projects when there are so many different stakeholders to work with, government entities to navigate, funding sources to manage, and in addition to kind of general advice for managing so much complexity around funding, grading, or blending, do you know of any specific project management or tracking and reporting tools or softwares that can help to keep those pieces straight?
Yeah, such a good question. So many players, so much funding, so much complexity. Um, in terms of tools, I think each organization has to kind of determine what works best for them. I highly do recommend a grant management tool of some sort. So whether that be Salesforce on one end, or there's some other kind of tools out there that are a little bit easier to navigate and kind of have a lower barrier. But I think there's also, that's kind of on like the customer relationship management or stakeholder relationship management side, can also be used for grant management. And then there's also just kind of the regular project management tools out there. But sometimes just a good old Excel file really does work, or Google Sheet, to keep track, especially with the grant requirements and dates of reporting. And then, of course, making sure that you have a robust financial tool in place to make sure you're tracking which funding source is supporting which project. So I wish I had more specifics. It is a complex situation, and I think having a really strong project management staff and then figuring out which tools really work best for your organization and, quite frankly, are affordable, easy to navigate, but highly recommend a robust financial system and a grant management tool.
Great, thank you. A question from Dorotha. Can you think of specific funding that we might seek out that is available for groups working with those living in low income and multifamily housing specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends. It depends. It's the ultimate answer. Definitely check out what is available. Again, I just am most familiar with what we have on our justice40accelerator.org website. If you go to opportunities at the top, you can see what's out there. But EPA is, has a variety of funding sources that are becoming available that I think are really good. Obviously, those DOE rebates are going to be really valuable. And real quick, touching back on EPA has some environmental justice small grants. They're restructuring their program this year, but just continue to look out for when that funding starts to flow. It's got a low barrier to access, and I think, and it's really quite flexible. So a variety of things. Definitely check out what's available on our Justice 40 Accelerator website. Check out what's available out there. Consider EPA, DOE, HUD, and USDA if you're in an area that you think might possibly qualify for rural. You'll be surprised. Sometimes the outskirts of metro areas actually do qualify for rural funding.
Great, thank you so much. That's the last question that I see specific to funding sources, and we've got about 8 minutes left. So wondering if Holly would be willing to come back on for a couple of other Buildings Up specific questions that have come in.
Of course, right here.
Amazing, thank you. There were a couple of questions related to projects that focus on solar. Are projects focused on solar installations eligible for the prize, or does that need to be just one component of an application that includes other measures?
The latter. So for the Buildings Upgrade Prize, the minimum required technologies are heat pumps and/or heat pump water heaters, plus weatherization that might be required to reduce energy bills. And then there are certainly additional technologies and strategies that teams can include in their building upgrade initiatives. So they might include solar. On top of that, I think Angelina mentioned some cases, kind of case studies that we have where solar is used to get those costs down. And so that could certainly be a part of a building upgrade initiative where many buildings would be upgraded with heat pumps and/or heat pump water heaters, and then solar on top of that. Geothermal also counts as the minimum technology, geothermal heat pump. And we've listed in the rules document a non-exhaustive list of other technologies and strategies that teams might consider offering in addition.
And one relevant follow-up on to that end, do energy resiliency measures qualify for these funds, such as microgrids, backup battery generators, and storage systems?
Yes, if the initiatives also include those minimum technologies of heat pump and/or heat pump water heater and energy efficiency upgrades where required to reduce energy costs. We never want to see building upgrades going in that are going to increase folks' energy costs unless they specifically okay that, unless the building occupants specifically say, no, I'm okay with that. I want my energy costs to go up because I want to do the right thing by the climate, for example. But otherwise, we want to avoid any cases where we're going to increase an occupant's energy costs.
And another question here. Will there be any teaming events for Buildings Up to help facilitate collaboration and sharing amongst teams, innovators, and those looking to build teams in their regions to apply with?
Yes, so we've just started working with a partner who's going to be organizing some teaming events. They'll be virtual. So hopefully they'll be easy for lots of folks to attend, and those should be announced shortly. So I encourage folks to follow the prize on the HeroX website. Click that follow button, create an account. It takes about 30 seconds to create an account, and then you'll receive updates from HeroX, including the dates and registration for those teaming events.
Great, that's very exciting. Let's see. So I think this is our last question, unless anything else comes in, but do you have any advice for individuals or teams that are working in states that have restrictions that don't allow cities to advocate for one form of energy over another? For example, not being able to advocate directly to improve the delivery of renewables in buildings. How do you suggest that teams located in states with those kinds of restrictions address the electrification requirements in their concept plans and their prize submissions?
Yeah, we certainly understand that there are communities that have those restrictions, but we encourage teams to be formed in a multidisciplinary fashion with a number of different partners, which may or may not include local governments and or utilities. So there are lots of different opportunities with team partners that do have the ability to encourage different types of energy options for the building. So I think creating your team in a strategic way can be really helpful in those locations.
Great. Well, thank you, Holly, so much for all of the information about the Buildings Upgrade Prize, and Angelina for the amazing presentation about accessing, braiding, blending, funding. So helpful. And I'm so glad that we had a robust amount of time for the Q&A to answer all of these great questions from everybody who's on the call today. And thanks so much to participants who shared resources in the chat. I hope everybody had a chance to take a look at some of those as well. And we'll be sending out links to the recordings and slides in English and Spanish within a couple of weeks to everyone who registered for today's webinar. And as Holly said, you can also look out on the HeroX website for other relevant updates and information about upcoming webinars, some of the teaming events, the office hours that we've got coming up. And we hope that we'll see many of you here today at the office hours session that we'll be hosting as a follow-up to this specific webinar, where we'll have even more time for in-depth Q&A related to accessing funding for these types of projects. So thank you so much to everyone for being here today, and to our amazing presenters, Angelina and Holly. Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.